Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and I'm the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. And it's my pleasure today to welcome you to what is our 19th presentation in the Auschwitz Speaker Series, offered by MCHE and Union Station, Kansas City, in support of the exhibition Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. Today, we're going to be joined by Paul Sammons, who is one of the curators of the exhibition. And I'm going to introduce you to Paul in just a minute, but before that, it's really my pleasure to introduce you to my friend and colleague, George Costello, who is the president and CEO of Union Station, Kansas City, and who has been the amazing partner in this project. So George, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessica. Here we go again. Someday we will be in a room together somewhere in the world. But thank you so much for allowing us to partner with the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education and make a significant change in our community as we transform our community and understanding the importance of diversity, inclusion, and equity, but most importantly, to understand the importance of this message that we are educating our community on. I'll give you our audience just a quick, brief moment. It's really an honor to have Paul with us. We've been waiting for this for quite some time. But I think what we've learned from COVID is that nothing is really able to stop a powerful partnership to share with the community a story that must be told. Many communities, when COVID has addressed those issues, closed down, closed their doors. But this has invigorated us and invigorated both of our missions to ensure that we carry forward our goals. And to be able to share with the audience today that nearly 300,000 people have already purchased tickets. More than 3 sellout crowds of the Kansas City Chiefs have already seen this exhibition. And over 30,000 school groups, children, have been through this exhibition at no cost. So the countless lives that we have touched. And now, being able to work closely with Luis and the team, especially in Poland, to extend the exhibition, it's my great honor to tell you that we only have less than 30,000 tickets available till the end of the run in March 20th. Very few tickets. That's less than 10% of the total number of tickets that we have available. So I hope all of the audiences, if they haven't seen the exhibition, act quickly. And then, of course, in the next few weeks, as we address some of the most solemn times of the Holocaust, the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and what we will be doing with the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, we will be adding a special artifacts and tell the story of one of our own local, that epitomizes the story and the challenges of our own survivors. So Sonia, we will have an artifact from her mother and telling the story of Sonia, as well as putting an explanation point on our Kansas City Holocaust Memorial and those that continue to remain in our community that we must never forget, and we must never allow anything to ever happen to them or anyone else. And then to be able to support the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education financially, this exhibition has allowed us to support the work of Jessica and her team and her board. And now the extension will allow us to continue the work after this exhibition is closed. As we, Jessica, I don't know what we're going to call it with the, I don't particularly want to call it the Auschwitz Scholar Program, but where we will be sending at no cost teachers in our community to Auschwitz to have a deeper understanding so that they can come back and continue to tell the story. So with once an idea and a dream 5 years ago when we had a chance to meet Luis and have a chance to understand Paul and what his expertise, we're able to make a difference in Kansas City. So we've only started. This isn't the end, it's only the beginning. And we look forward to holding hands and crossing the street together with the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education as we continue to make a strategic change in our world. We have many more to go, but Jessica, I know how difficult it has been to do all these things, and we greatly appreciate what you and Shelley have done and your board, and we look forward to many years forward. So thank you for letting us be part of this.
Thank you so much, George. This partnership has been remarkable, and the work that you and your team have done to allow us to spread this educational message, it's imperative that people see the exhibition and then take that learning to the next level. And this partnership has really embraced that philosophy, and I'm so grateful for that. Today, we are operating in a Zoom webinar, so you will be able to ask questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. There will be times along the way as well that Paul is going to ask for your participation in the chat, and then we'll be joined by MCHE's historian, Dr. Shelley Klein, who will be communicating that information to Paul along the way. Paul Sammons is an independent curator and an educational specialist, and he is one of the curators of this exhibition, Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. He worked for 10 years at the Imperial War Museum, and in addition to being fundamentally involved in their exhibition about the Holocaust, he was key to developing their distinctive educational approach. He is the founding director of the Center for Holocaust Education at University College London. He has served on the United Kingdom delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance for approximately 20 years. He's consulted on numerous international projects, and he is currently a United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Fellow. He is the first Leslie and Susan Gonda Goldschmied Foundation Fellow. Paul is one of the first people that I met and my team met when we were first meeting with George and working to understand how we could supplement this exhibition. We had wonderful conversations with Paul and Luis. And what I learned from those conversations is how gifted Paul is at truly educating, taking apart a document or a photograph and helping us understand how to look at it in a deep and meaningful way. And so, though we wanted to bring him into the Kansas City community in person to do that work, we're so pleased that he's able to join us today from the United Kingdom. And it's really my pleasure to introduce to you Paul Sammons.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jessica. I would love to be with you in Kansas City as well. And thank you, George, both your institutions, your organizations, for everything you've done. It's been truly remarkable, the number of visitors you've had to the exhibition. And it's obviously a real privilege for me to be able to join you today. I know I speak on behalf of all the team who are involved in the exhibition, Luis and Musealia as well, just how delighted we are with how things have gone there. And I hope maybe I can still have an opportunity to visit you in Kansas even after the exhibition has moved on, and perhaps to work with your teachers and your colleagues and your public. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this speaker series. I'm going to share my screen now, and let's hope this works. So you should see a presentation called Frozen Moments. So please shout out if it's not showing, but I believe the technology is all working fine right now. What I'd love to explore with you today is this issue of photographs from Auschwitz, photographs taken at the time, and what we might be able to learn from a kind of forensic reading of those images, how we can look more deeply into this history through the photographic image. And much of what I'll be sharing is part of a kind of complementary exhibition to the one hosted at the moment in Union Station, a photographic exhibition that Musealia also produced and I was involved in curating, called Seeing Auschwitz. And what we'll be looking at there is the impact of photographs on our knowledge and our understanding and our memory of this difficult time and this historic place. So I'll begin just with some questions really that I'd like to try and cover during the session. Picturing Auschwitz, why does the photographic record matter? What is it about photographs that hold a particular kind of strong evidential truth for us? Why are photographs generally so compelling? There seems to be something about the photographic image which holds our attention. It can feel sometimes that we're even kind of looking through a window in time directly onto the past. It can feel, when we hold a photograph in our hands, that we hold a kind of slice of time in our hands. We say things like, seeing is believing, or the camera never lies. We say these things even when we know, of course, that things are faked and that the camera doesn't always tell the truth. But there's something about visual evidence of the past which is very important to us, and has a great impact, I think, on the way that we think about, the way we imagine, the way that we remember Auschwitz, and of course other elements of the past as well. Having said that, I'd also like to consider what are some of the limitations of photography for our understanding of the past, and I'll rely on some theorists of photography, some philosophers and some others to think through both the power of photography and also, as I say, some of its limitations. And we'll ask, given those limitations, how can we begin to read photographs for deeper meaning? And how can we even see perhaps beyond the frame of the image itself? How can we read through and between different photographs and relate it to other kinds of evidence? So these are some of the things. We'll see how much of this we can get through in the next sort of 45 minutes or an hour, and love to have questions at the end and an open discussion. But as we go through, I'll also, as Jessica mentioned, be asking you to consider some questions that I'll ask you to share your thinking in the chat, in that function as well. And we'll begin with that, just thinking about what comes to mind when you hear the name Auschwitz. I don't mean by that, what do you know about Auschwitz, but rather, what do you see in your mind's eye? What kind of mental image do you have? What picture do you have? If you were to picture just a single scene from Auschwitz, really visualize that time and place, how would you describe that to someone? So not what do you know about Auschwitz, not what the history of Auschwitz was, but just if you picture a scene unfolding at Auschwitz during the time of the Second World War, of the Holocaust, what sorts of things would you be seeing happening there? In the chat function, if you're happy just to jot down some first thoughts, I'd be really interested to have a sense of what kinds of things you're picturing before we look at any photographs themselves. So we've got, I'm seeing there's a lot coming in, crowds of people, all ages, malnourished, sad, desperate faces, selection upon arrival at the camp, gas chambers, the entrance, people in the bed, sorting chaos and fear, smoke rising from stacks, the Arbeitsfrei gates, a very iconic image, railroad cars, people disembarking. Okay, so we're getting a kind of sense of a kind of collective picture, if you like, of how we remember, our collective memory of Auschwitz, our picture of what this place was like. So if we move on to a kind of classic image, many of the things which you're describing, I think we can see framed in this kind of iconic picture of Auschwitz. Those of you that were thinking of arrival in Auschwitz, thinking of the ramp, thinking of the process of selection, you know, we see here actually a scene from Auschwitz-Birkenau. I'm sure many of you know that Auschwitz was not just a single place in time. It was not just one camp, but actually a vast complex of three major camps, Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, and Auschwitz III, and close to 50 sub-camps covering an area of some 16 square miles. So it developed, it grew, it expanded, and its functions changed over the period of time from 1940, when it was first established close to the Polish town of Oswiecim, the German name for that town being Auschwitz, right the way through to January 1945, when it was abandoned by the SS as the Soviet soldiers advanced on their way towards Berlin. So this is one of those sites, Auschwitz II, the largest of all the camps, not only within the Auschwitz complex, but the largest German Nazi concentration camp in all of occupied Europe. And what we see in the background here, I hope you can see my cursor, I'll try and indicate parts of the photograph, this entrance gate, so-called Gate of Death, through which the train has entered on a railway spur and arrived at a halt on the ramp, and these people, thousands of people, have spilled out onto the platform. And we see here men, women and children. We see SS men in uniform directing proceedings. We see other men in the striped uniforms of the concentration camp system who are being forced, of course, to assist in this process, this kind of organization. So these images are so powerful and so strong that when we think about Auschwitz, often this is what we'll be picturing. Yeah, these are the kinds of scenes that we'll see in our mind's eye. They've made a kind of indelible print on our collective memory. And what I want to highlight here is that not only will you see this image and others like it in every exhibition about Auschwitz or the Holocaust, in every documentary film, but also fictional feature films that are made about Auschwitz. Schindler's List, for example, will be that this will be the source where directors dress and position their actors as they kind of recreate the scenes from the past. So this visual source has entered into our language, into our thinking, into our consciousness. But what's so remarkable about it is that every single image that we have of arrival and selection in Auschwitz comes from just one source. This photograph album. This was found hundreds of miles away from Auschwitz towards the end of the Second World War, and it was found by chance. If this album hadn't been found, we wouldn't have a single image of arrival and selection at Auschwitz in existence. What would our picture of that place and that time be then? I mean, we would rely, of course, on other sources. We'd rely on, as we also do, of written documents, of the testimonies of survivors, of the remnants of the place itself, the artifacts that have been found there, many of the things which you see in the Auschwitz exhibition, but we wouldn't have any of this photographic evidence. So these images, such as the one we've just looked at, come from this book's pages. And this is the only copy of that album that is known to still be in existence. As I say, it was found by chance. It was found in Dora Mittelbau, a concentration camp in the Herz Mountains in the Third Reich. As the Allies advanced towards Berlin, the SS abandoned camp after camp and fled and retreated deeper into the Third Reich, driving thousands, tens of thousands of the surviving prisoners with them and murdering many of them on the way. By the time that the American soldiers entered into Dora Mittelbau, there was just a small dying remnant left, and amongst those, that remnant was a young woman called Lily Jacob. She was sick with typhus. She was close to death herself. She staggered outside of her bunk when she heard the commotion outside, and as the American soldiers entered the camp, she collapsed onto the ground. Unseen hands carried her to an SS barracks, a former barracks of the SS soldiers, the Nazi guards, and laid her in a comfortable bed for the first time in a couple of years. And it was the cold that awoke her. She was roused from her sleep, feeling the cold, and searched for some warm blankets, something to, some kind of clothing. And she opened the bedside cabinet, the drawer of the cabinet, and underneath some neatly folded pajamas, she found this book. Opening the pages, she saw photographs like the one we've been looking at here. But she also, turning those pages, found a collection of close to 200 photographs of Auschwitz-Birkenau, as I say, of this arrival and selection process, and including this photograph here, where remarkably she realizes also as she turns these pages that many of the photographs were actually taken on the very day she herself had arrived in Auschwitz with her family, with her community. And we even see her, she saw herself in this photograph, right in the center here of this front row, this young woman here with her hands hanging by her sides is Lily Jacob, staring back at her from months before and hundreds of miles away, and a kind of lifetime ago, if you like, at the day that she actually arrived and was selected for labor in Auschwitz. As she turned the pages, she also saw the faces of her own brothers, these young children, Israel and Zelig Jacob, who were murdered on the day this photograph was taken. These are children that were killed in the gas chambers, as were most of the people that arrived with Lily. So think how important this document found by chance is for not only Lily Jacob, but also other survivors of Auschwitz who have pored over these images, searching for a last glimpse of their loved ones. That deep personal significance is matched only by the historical importance of this document, because, as I say, it is the only evidence, photographic evidence, we have of arrival and selection in Auschwitz. Taken in May, most of them taken in May of 1944. These photographs are arranged no more than 4 to a page throughout the album, grouped into different categories, captioned. You can see here a photograph is missing. We know that Lily actually removed a few of the photographs and gave them to people who recognized their loved ones. So today, as I say, we have a little under 200 photographs still in existence on these pages. They're kept in the archives of Yad Vashem, the museum in Israel, Jerusalem. These photographs now, as I say, seem to give us a kind of window on the past, but I also want to think about the kinds of limitations that photographs have for us. Susan Sontag, philosopher and essayist, did a lot of thinking about photography and its power, also spoke about the limitation of a still photograph to have any kind of real explanatory power, because each of these images, of course, is just a fleeting moment in time. It's a kind of atom of time captured on photographic paper. So the very thing which gives it its evidential quality, the fact that light passes through a lens, reacts with the chemicals on photographic paper and creates this image, is, as Barter said, a kind of certificate of presence. The things that are happening in this image had to actually take place in real life. This train had to be there. These people had to be there in these positions for the image to be created. It's not like a drawing or a painting or a written record of an event. It had to exist in this way for the image to actually exist at all. In that sense, it's a certificate of presence. But the limitation is that it's only one fleeting moment of time, 125th of a second, perhaps. And what Sontag tells us is that in order to really fully understand events, we have to see how different moments in time relate to each other over time, how different events, how different places can be connected. And the very compilation of the album itself is a form of narration in that way. So whoever pasted these images onto these pages assembled them and arranged them in a certain way, and we can see a kind of process of narration going on with the arrival of trains, this one on the left being empty, its doors still open, we can see the possessions of the people still lying there, the train on the right being still closed, the people are still on that train. And then in the next image, we see it's as if this first train on the left has now departed and the other train has been opened and the people are spilling out. So there's a kind of rhythm to this organization, which shows something of the process involved. And from the perspective of the people that took these photographs and pasted them into this album, the kind of efficiency of that process. Let's take a look at the photograph on the top right a little bit more closely. And I'd like you to have a think for a moment about what is the subject of this photograph. That can give us some clues as to who took the image. What's this actually a photograph of? It's not a photo of the individuals that we see in this image, right? There's a group, there's a mass. Rather, it's a kind of tableau. It shows a panorama of destruction. The gateway that we saw in the first image that we looked at together, that gate of death, if you like, is behind us now. And we're looking further along the train lines in the direction of travel of these people who are becoming sorted and grouped, but they are on their way, and the train itself leads our eye into the distance. The railway tracks lead our eye further into the image, so that in the background we can see two large buildings with these tall brick chimneys, one on the left here and one on the right. These are the buildings of Crematoria 2 and Crematoria 3. Crematoria 4 and 5 are further off to the right in the birch grove that we don't see in these images, but are documented in other photographs in the album. By framing the photograph in this way, there's a clear composition. This is what indicates to us as well is that this is a professional photographer, someone who knows what they're doing, right? The photograph has been carefully taken and constructed to include all these different details so that we almost see the kind of passage of time. We see the arrival of the train, the unloading of the people, the direction of movement, and we also see their final destination, for most of them, in the gas chambers and the crematorium ovens. Most of the people you see in this image will be dead within hours. The very fact that this is taken in broad daylight and from the roof of this train shows there's nothing clandestine about this, and the time with which it's been composed and the ease with which it's taken obviously also indicates something to us about the photographer, that they have permission to do this. There's nothing secretive about it. We know that in Auschwitz there was an identification department, and that most of the photographs of Auschwitz were taken by this department. Not only the kind of mug shots, the prisoner photographs, the registration photographs that I'm sure you've all seen with the sort of three images of someone looking forward, someone with the same person in side profile and 3/4 image. Those photographs were also the result of that department's work, but also construction work in the camp, other albums that we have, not showing arrival and selection, but other aspects of the history of Auschwitz, taken by the same department. So we know that the head of that department, Bernhard Wolter, or his assistant, Ernst Hoffmann, are most likely the photographers behind these images also. The witting testimony of this image then is this kind of orderly process of destruction. That's the intent of the photographer. But one thing we should remind ourselves of whenever we're looking at any photograph is that however many people you see in the image itself, hundreds here, a few thousand, there are always at least two other people that are present. One of those people is the photographer themselves. We can't see the photographer, but clearly the choice of this image, the composition of it, the moment at which the shutter was depressed so the image was taken, all show the perspective, the choices, the interests, the concerns, and the worldview of that photographer. They take this photograph in this way, and therefore they are also present in the image. But we are also present in this image in the sense that the way that we read this photograph obviously has a different meaning to us today than it did to the person who was actually taking it or to the people who were there in the scene itself. So we also affect the reading of this evidence. The challenge for us, I think, is how do we resist the perpetrator's gaze? We are forced on one level to share the same perspective as the cameraman. We look through an SS viewfinder. We see through his eyes. And so we're given that image. So we see the witting testimony of this sort of so-called orderly process of destruction. But we can work a little harder, I think, and look more closely into the image itself for the things and the details that he was not really so interested in capturing. Look more closely at the people in the crowd who are simply objects to him, really. A kind of cargo to be dealt with. And we see this young boy gazing back at us. Having noticed the photographer on the roof of the train, he looks directly into the camera lens, and decades later, we have a sense almost that he's looking at us. When we see him, when we notice him, we see not just a mass of people in the crowd, as the photographer did, but we start to see individuals. We start to see men, women, and children, real people. Behind him, we notice this sort of interaction. They're not a faceless mass as they were to the photographer in this scene, but they have agency. Someone's helping another with her bag, with her heavy sack. And if we look at some of those other sacks, we start to see also, in a sense, the world before, the life that they brought with them to this death camp, not knowing where they were going. People packed, of course, pots and pans, shaving brushes, hairbrushes, change of clothing, cheese graters, because they thought they were coming here for a new life. On the left-hand side, people are linking arms. A woman is carrying her baby in her arms. In the front, in the foreground here, we see an interaction between a prisoner and a new arrival. Now, the role, the function of the prisoners was to get people to move into groups very quickly, men and older boys on one side, women and young children on the other. And they were supposed to just give these kinds of directions, and they were there to pick up the baggage that was left behind, to clear that. They were under strict instructions not to have any further interaction, not to have any discussions. But here we see, unnoticed probably by the photographer, some kind of perhaps more intimate conversation taking place. The body language would show, would indicate is something else is happening than simply go and stand over there. So we can only speculate as to what that information might have been, but we do know from various witness testimony that some of these prisoners on the ramp would utter a few quick words of advice to the new arrivals. To a mother with her young child, it might be pass the baby to the grandmother. The woman would have no idea, no understanding of what was coming, but if she did that, if she passed her child to an elderly relative, perhaps she would have a little more chance of passing the selection and not going straight to the gas chambers. The child was already doomed. The elderly grandparent was already marked for death. Or they might say to an adolescent, say you're a little older, say you're 18 years old, tell them you've got a trade. Some hurried words of advice that would help them pass the selection process, which are also documented in this album's pages. And if you see this single story building on the left-hand side, we're going to move with the photographer along the train a little bit further to this point, and you'll see it now in the background, that same building, and this moment of selection taking place. So here, the men have been divided from the women. They stand in this hot sun. The SS, still obviously with their heads covered, the men have been ordered to take off their hats. And they're walking towards an SS doctor, a Nazi doctor, who looks at each person in turn and decides very quickly whether they will go straight to their deaths in the gas chambers, or whether a few of them, a small percentage, will be chosen for hard manual work in the camp. How long does this doctor take over that life or death decision? How much consideration does he give to each person? Now, what we're told by Sontag, of course, again, is that the limits of the photographic evidence here again. lacks explanatory power because it's just this frozen moment, as I've termed it. But actually, again, if we read more deeply into the image, it is, I think, possible to even see the passage of time within a frozen moment. Search the image for clues as to how long it takes to decide whether someone goes to their death or whether they go into the camp for this manual work, this slave labor. And if you notice the distance between this group where this moment of decision is being taken place and those walking away, and beyond them, this other small group with this man in the middle being helped along with this walking stick here, and each other group walking towards this group of men who we know are on their way to the gas chambers. This short distance between each individual and each small group gives us the indication of a matter of seconds where each decision is taken. So this man's fate will be decided in a few short moments. Now, most of the time, I think when we see these sorts of images, because we see through the eyes of the photographer, because we are forced to kind of share that gaze, and we don't see the individuals themselves, we don't see their faces very clearly. We tend to sort of see the scene and perhaps move on. If we are seeing this in an exhibition, how much time do most visitors give a photograph like this? Probably not much more time than the SS doctor gave the individual standing in front of him. And I think this raises an ethical problem for us. I think from the perspective of today, again, to break that Nazi gaze, we need to spend a little longer with each of these photographs. We need to look at each of these people in turn and try to conjure something of who these people were. Who did they love? Who loved them? What did they do with their lives? These lives which are going to end in a few short hours. These people will have been murdered and turned to ash. What did they do before? What work did they do? Where did they live? What hopes and dreams did they have? I think it's beholden on us to slow down and to read these images consciously, differently than the way that they were intended when the shutter was depressed. Moving on, we see another striking image. We just return for a moment, to the photograph we see here. So I think these have come out of order slightly. This is the image I want to show you next. We see in that large collection of photographs, or that one album, through the eyes of the SS, there is another collection of photographs. Only 4 of them exist, from a single roll of film this time, that was also taken in Auschwitz, in Birkenau, at the same time that the Auschwitz album was being constructed, in the summer of 1944. Now, the Auschwitz album, every photograph that we see in this album is somehow pregnant with violence. You know, we know that within a short time, the people in these photographs will be murdered. But we don't see the violence itself. The photographs that the SS have chosen to take and to record and to paste into their album shows what they see as their work, as a kind of efficient job. There are no photographs of the inside of the gas chambers. There are no photographs of the murder process itself. There are no photographs of bodies. But these photographs were taken actually not by the SS, but by their victims. These photographs are taken by members of the Sonderkommando who worked inside the crematoria. So a group of Jewish Sonderkommando in the summer of 1944 managed to get hold of a camera and a roll of film. There are different accounts for how that happened. Perhaps most likely it was a camera which was brought to the camp by new arrivals, and in the sorting process was able to be taken and smuggled to these individuals working in the gas chambers. And these photographs, some of them are actually taken from inside the gas chamber looking out in crematorium 5 in the birch grove, and we see these birch trees. Very often in documentaries, in exhibitions, in books, those photographs are shown severely cropped so that you see a close-up, for instance, in the left-hand side here, of this plume of smoke which is rising from a mass burial pit. The crematoria ovens were so choked with the bodies of the dead by, oh, sorry, problem with my presentation. The murders were so intense by this period that actually the ovens couldn't keep up. And so they took to burning the bodies of many people in these open pits next to the crematoria. This is what we're seeing here from inside the inside crematoria 5, looking out into one of these burial pits. As I say, often it's presented as a kind of close-up so that we see the detail more closely. But what we chose to do in both of these exhibitions, Auschwitz not long ago, not far away, and Seeing Auschwitz, is instead to show the uncropped image, because then you actually see the position of the photographer themselves. So it's not only the subject which they're taking, and for them, the subject isn't some kind of orderly process, as the SS like to show, but rather the ferocity of the killing, the reality, the evidence of mass murder. And so we look into these images, and of course they haven't got the advantages of the SS soldier. They can't take these photographs openly. They are risking their lives to take these images, and they are hurried, furtively taken clandestine photographs, taken perhaps with trembling hands, so much so that the fourth photograph here, this one on the bottom right, doesn't even come out properly at all. It's just the kind of silhouettes of the trees against the sky. They risked their lives every time they took the camera out. This roll of film was smuggled out of the camp to the Polish resistance. It's a radically different image though, right, of that same time and place. So rather than a photograph being a window on the past, instead what we have is the actual gaze and the position of the person who takes it. Reading beyond the frame of the image itself and thinking about the person involved in its construction. In this case, in the risks they took. A different photograph album emerged in much more recent years. I believe in 2007, this photograph album that this photo comes from, which has been called the Hoeker album, after this man in the front here, Karl Hoeker. I believe it was his photograph album because he appears on pretty much every page. This was given to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and is now in their collection, and contains many photographs also of Auschwitz and also in the same period. This is also Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. So it's the same time and place as the Auschwitz album, the Lily Jacob album that we saw first, and the Sonderkommando photos. But here, rather than these kind of ciphers of SS men standing on the ramp doing their job, if you like, doing their work, we see something of them as they saw themselves. This is in a place close to Auschwitz, just a few miles away by the river Sola, a place called Solohutte, which is a kind of rest and recuperation area. And here we see some 70 or so SS men from Auschwitz singing together while an accordionist sways to the music. Not only this, but some of the most prominent people in Auschwitz are pictured here in this moment of relaxation. I mentioned Karl Hoeker, whose album it was. Hoeker was adjutant to the commandant of Auschwitz, the new commandant, Richard Bayer, who is pictured next to him here, leaning against that railing. Now, as the adjutant, Hoeker had intimate knowledge of everything that was happening. Next to Bayer is Rudolf Höss, who had been the former commandant of Auschwitz and had returned to Auschwitz in the summer of 1944 to help organize the mass murder of Hungarian Jewish men, women, and children, the largest deportation to Auschwitz in its existence, and the kind of crescendo of the killing process. It was named in his honor, Action Höss. Between Bayer and Hoeker, just one step behind, this man here, Otto Moll, was in charge of the gas chambers in Auschwitz-Birkenau. A little further to the right, just behind here, Joseph Kramer was the commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau. So Bayer, the commandant of the whole of Auschwitz complex, Bayer, the commandant of the death camp Birkenau, Auschwitz II. And a little to the right again, we see, if I can get this cursor to work here, this man might be recognizable to you. This is Dr. Mengele, the so-called angel of death, who selected Jewish children and Roma children and others for the most obscene human experiments. And we see them here in their camaraderie, in their, as I say, rest and recuperation. What kind of men were they? One of the things about the Auschwitz album, the Lily Jacob album, is that we don't really see them as individuals. They can kind of remain somehow the fantasies of just the Nazi monster. There's nothing really which challenges our view of that. But here we see them a little bit more horrifically like us. And if we think about who these people were before they came to Auschwitz, what prepared them for this kind of career? Well, Bayer, the commandant of Auschwitz, made sweets. He was a confectioner before the war. Otto Moll, who ran the gas chambers, was a gardener. Karl Hoeker was a bank clerk. Kramer here was an accountant, a middle-class boy from Munich. And Mengele, of course, was a medical doctor. Now, a cross-section of society, after all, what could prepare someone for this kind of role? There's nothing extraordinary about them in that way, which of course makes it only more extraordinarily horrific that they carried out these functions and these jobs. We see Hoeker again in the center here from the same album, this time surrounded by some of the women from the Helferinnen, about 200 or so women, several hundred, who were telephonists and secretaries in Auschwitz, and who we see in these photographs, in this particular one, eating bowls of blueberries, which they've got here, laughing, joking, fooling around. We see them flirting with the SS officers. They're also a part of this story. Something which we don't see within, of course, the Sonderkommando photographs or the Lily Jacob album. And here, the veranda of the wooden lodge at Sollerhütte, this place of rest and recuperation and relaxation, where people sunbathed. Nearby, they went swimming in the river, or they went walking and hiking in the hills. It's a beautiful place. And within just a few short miles from those gas chambers and burning ovens of Auschwitz. Another set of photographs come from another perspective, which is the aerial reconnaissance photos, in this case taken by the Royal Air Force, the RAF, British Air Force, flying over in this case, Birkenau, again in the summer of 1944. And this photograph shows us here the railway spur going into the camp. So this is that gate of death at the bottom here that we saw in that first image. Here is the train arriving on the ramp. This is where people were unloaded. This is where they were selected. And those that we saw walking from that selection, those men were walking further down this pathway to either on the left here, crematoria crematorium 2 or crematorium 3. With those, we saw them in the distance with those brick chimneys. Over on the right, we see crematoriums 4 and 5 amongst this birch grove. Another photograph, also taken in the summer of 1944, just a little later, are photographs taken from the bomber aircraft that followed these reconnaissance photos. And we see here bombs falling apparently over Birkenau itself. Now, by this time, the killing process, the extermination plans of the Nazis were very well known and well documented. So news had been coming out from occupied Europe from the summer of 1941 of mass shootings in the East. That news continued to filter through as the death camps were built, as the gassings began, and the murder of millions in 1942. News of that was getting to the British and to the Americans as early as that. By 1944, when these photographs were taken, escapees from Auschwitz, amongst them Rudolf Ferber and Alfred Wetzler, had made their way back to their homes in Slovakia and actually written what have become known as the Auschwitz Protocols, with detailed descriptions of the arrival, the selection, the murder in gas chambers, and hand-drawn diagrams of those gas chambers as well. So the Allies, the British and the Americans, knew what was happening in this very place. And so as we see these bombs dropping, apparently over the places of the gas chambers of crematorium 2 and 3 and nearby 4 and 5, we could imagine that this is the target for these falling bombs. But of course, what we haven't done here is to take into account the height of the plane, the speed of the plane, its direction and the trajectory. And actually these bombs are being aimed not at these places directly beneath us, but actually another part of Auschwitz several miles away, Auschwitz 3, Monowitz, where there was a large industrial plant. The second largest corporation at the time, IG Farben, had a vast factory system using slave labor from Auschwitz to make synthetic oil and synthetic rubber for the German war effort. That was the target, not the extermination process, but because it never became a war aim of the British or the Americans or the Soviets to directly rescue the Jews of Europe. The idea was, if we could win the war as fast as possible, people across Nazi-occupied Europe would be liberated from terrible persecution and murder. But even knowing the railway lines were here, knowing about the gas chambers, this is not the target of the Allies. And instead what we're seeing is exactly that same time and place, Auschwitz-Birkenau in the summer of 1944, but from thousands of feet in the air, which somehow is a kind of metaphor, I think, for the distance in understanding between the Allies and the events that were unfolding. They had knowledge, but perhaps not full understanding. They didn't see this in the same way that we see and understand it today. To conclude, I want to pull together a few of these images from these different sources. This is another photograph from the so-called Auschwitz album, the Lily Jacob album. After the murder of the new arrivals, their possessions were taken from them. Everything that people brought with them, their clothing, their spectacles, their pots and pans, in this case, their shoes, had some value, some worth in Auschwitz. And in an area of the camp which was nicknamed Canada, as a kind of land of plenty, these possessions of the dead were being sorted. In this case, this mound of thousands upon thousands of shoes sorted by women prisoners in the camp. Now, this is, of course, again, the perspective of the photographer, the SS man who takes this image. What he's trying to show in this photograph and in this document of the album is, go back to that idea of the efficient, orderly process through which people arrive, they are sorted, they are murdered. We don't see the images of that, but their possessions are dealt with and the process efficiently continues. The unwitting testimony, though, can be seen if you look in the background here, this plume of smoke drifting across, of no real interest to the photographer and really not noticed by us as the viewer unless we look really closely. But think where that plume of smoke is coming from. Canada is in the same location, the same part of the camp, close to crematorium 4 and 5, where we see the Sonderkommando photographs of that rising plume of smoke. The smoke which we see drifting across here is the smoke from the burning pyres of the people who perhaps were shortly before wearing these shoes. The two photographs, as Sontag reminds us, are frozen moments on their own, not capable of real explanatory power. But when we start to juxtapose them, when we place them together, when we make connections between them, new understandings can emerge. And if we follow that theme of the rising smoke, we see it again in that photograph by the RAF flying over Auschwitz. This is crematorium 5. I'm not saying, of course, it's not the same moment, the same day necessarily as the photograph taken by the Sonderkommando, but it is the same period and it is the same place. Here we see again the perspective of someone there on the ground urgently trying to get the news out to the Allies, desperate for some kind of intervention. And here we get the image from the Allies' perspective, where they're not really interested in Birkenau as a place of extermination and mass murder, but rather the whole complex and its role in the German war effort, which is why the industry is targeted and the gas chambers are not. And while this is happening, the men and women of Auschwitz, working in Auschwitz, running Auschwitz, organizing Auschwitz, are eating blueberries, singing songs, and sunbathing in Solehütte. It feels like when we just see the image, it can appear like a kind of different world. But by placing them together, what I really want to say is that this is the same place and the same time. And for those in this final photograph, these places are so intimately connected because what they are doing in their work in Auschwitz is trying to create a world without Jews. And in Solehütte, this place by the river, they're enjoying that world. The purpose of Auschwitz is to create for the Nazis a utopia of this world in which Jews don't exist anymore. And Solehütte itself and the pleasure they're taking there is somehow not only what allows them to do this work, where they relax and they recuperate and they enjoy themselves, but it's actually what somehow gives meaning to that mass murder process. So what I want to try and show is that if we take the photographs and read them more than just the frame, what's in the image itself, if we look beyond the frame and try to make these kinds of connections, different kinds of meanings can emerge. And the key point being that the photograph shares the gaze of the person who took it, but in each different image, a radically different truth of that same time and place is revealed to us. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Love to take some thoughts, comments. Perhaps I'll stop sharing while we do that.
Thank you, Paul, for that presentation. It gave us a lot to think about and certainly plenty of ways to complicate images that maybe we've seen before. So that's always a useful perspective. There are a couple of comments you may have seen here, just to ask a few questions out of the chat. Someone asked early on about some of the markings when you were showing the early photos of arrival photos, and when there was a picture missing, there seemed to be some markings behind it. So if you could tell us a little bit about what that was. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, apologies. So yeah, several of the images which showed the relatives of survivors were identified, and Lily, who discovered the album, before perhaps fully appreciating the full historic significance of this, through acts of compassion, gave these photographs out, which is why we have these sort of blank spaces. The kinds of annotations are kind of post hoc, the kinds of things which have been made up and marked up by conservators or the archivists, or possibly even as well, I don't know the detail of the particular markings, but these photographs in this album were also used in post-war testimony, and also the photographs themselves, where copies were made of them. Copies were made and used in the war crimes trials also. So this is not markings by the album itself. Bears the captions and the headings and the inscriptions from the Nazis' point of view, most likely done by a prisoner in Auschwitz. But those other markings were after the fact, after the discovery of the album.
You mentioned the other exhibition you worked on, Seeing Auschwitz. I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about that, and perhaps how you made the decisions which photographs to include in that exhibition.
Sure. So Seeing Auschwitz was created for the 75th anniversary of Auschwitz. As I mentioned, Musealia produced it in collaboration with the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, but it was produced for the United Nations and for UNESCO. So it first opened simultaneously in Paris and in New York, and was an attempt to mark that anniversary, to create a new way of thinking about this past through the photographic evidence. And it is very much intended to do the kinds of things I was talking about here, to help hopefully visitors to read those kinds of images more critically, not just to use them as kind of illustrations of a text, but rather to think about who the photographers were, the different kinds of images we have, and how that notion of seeing Auschwitz being really about whose gaze are we sharing, how does that impact what we think we know about that place, and how can we complicate that through these kinds of deeper readings. So it's presently about to open in Madrid at the end of this month. Previously it was in the Basque Country in Spain as well, and so now it travels.
Thank you. Somebody else has asked a question about as the war was ending, did the SS destroy other photographic evidence that they might have had?
Absolutely, yeah, this is a really good question. And as the war, I mean, the Holocaust is both the story of utter destruction, of course, not only of people, but also of evidence. And yet it's also the example of genocide that is the most extensively documented and most intensively researched, and therefore probably the best understood in all of human history. So there's a kind of paradox there. The reason being because the Nazis fell back in retreat, and obviously would continue to fight to the last, while they had done everything that a modern bureaucratic industrial nation needs to do for such a vast continent-wide project in terms of orders and photographs and documents, and they were busy in the final months trying to destroy as much as they could. So even earlier, Himmler actually ordered a special commando to move throughout Eastern Europe, digging up mass graves and burning the bodies of the dead. You know, they took everything they could to try and destroy not only photographs but documents also. Now in Auschwitz, they set a light barracks and tried to burn those down, but they didn't have time to destroy them all. So there were also surviving documents which show the blueprints of the architectural blueprints of the gas chambers, marked up to show, you know, of course, their function as well. So we have that evidence. And then those photographs that I mentioned, also taken by the identification department, that were the sort of prisoner mugshots. The reason we have those, some of them still in extant today, the Nazis tried to destroy them. They ordered for them to be burned, but the prisoners that they ordered burn them tried to preserve as many as they could, and they stuffed wet rags into the flues of the ovens. So while many did burn, some 30,000 or so actually survived, which is why we have those images, and we don't just have the lists of names, but we can also identify the actual people and what they look like as well.
Are there any other collections of Holocaust photos that you have worked on or that you're interested in working on and analyzing in the future?
Yes, and seeing Auschwitz actually displays more of Auschwitz than I was able to show in this, but also supplements them with, say, prisoner drawings. There's a sketchbook that was made in the camp, concealed within the camp, which shows a very important contrast and juxtaposition with the photographic evidence that we have here. The Auschwitz exhibition, obviously in Union Station right now, has many different photographs from many different areas. One of the sets of photographs that we also show in Seeing Auschwitz, I didn't have time to include in this presentation, are the photographs that people brought with them to the camp. So these are kind of pre-war photographs showing who these victims and their families were in their life before. Beautiful photographs of newborn babies, of days out with family, of trips to the seaside, or typical kind of family photographs that we all have as well, that were hidden in Auschwitz by the prisoners. A collection of more than 2,000 of them, which we also show to kind of indicate something of who these people were beyond the way that the perpetrators showed. So yeah, we're rich in photographic sources, and not only of Auschwitz, but as you say, of many other collections as well. And each image, as I said, I think if we read them carefully and we read them for meaning, they reveal more than just we actually see in the image itself. There's an exhibition that USHMM produced that I've done some educational work on for them as well, called Some Were Neighbours, and using some of the same kinds of techniques for reading images that we see here on Auschwitz, I've tried to apply those to some of their photographs, and that's becoming part of their educational approach also now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very, again, very useful, especially when some of these images, you say, people have glanced at them, seen them, think that they know them, but haven't taken more than a moment to perhaps analyze them. With Seeing Auschwitz, is there an online version that people could access, or is this something they'd have to see in person?
At the moment, really in person. We're developing the website a little bit further, and actually one of the things we would like to do, hopefully for the next venue, it depends on some technical issues, is to encourage visitors to that exhibition to take the photographs of what they see in the exhibition, and then to share with us perhaps the 3 most significant images. We're interested in what choices the visitor makes, what meaning they place on those, and we'd be fascinated to see the kinds of pictures of the past that visitors curate for themselves out of this evidence. And we hope, if we can manage that, perhaps in Madrid, maybe that becomes something which we can showcase not only on social media, but also on the Seeing Auschwitz website as well. So that's something which is kind of still in development.
And again, brings in yet another perspective of viewer, like another wall and dimension there. It's very, very interesting work. And perhaps finally, you somewhat touched on this, but given that there, as you say, the Holocaust is like the most photographed genocide in human history, there's so many photos out there. What direction would you like to see this sort of new, and I say new only because the technology we have now, it's not only just that we're learning to read photographs perhaps differently, but now different technologies allow us to zoom in, clarify, do some different types of work that we just were not able to do in the past. Where would you like to see the field go?
That's a really interesting idea. I mean, I think there are possibilities that people are beginning to explore through, for instance, virtual reality. How you could sort of step into a scene and view it, bringing together a number of different kinds of images of that same time and place. I mean, I've been looking with some colleagues at the potential, for instance, to think about a virtual reality exploration of Warsaw in the period of the ghetto, to somehow bring the places as they look today, but through a kind of interlacing of the images from the past, seeing how the remnants of the past remain in the present, and how the topography of where we might visit can actually help us understand and appreciate and read the image, but also how the image can kind of connect us to that place that we are either standing in physically or perhaps visiting virtually, if we're able to develop that technology a little further as well.
Yeah, I think that'd be an extraordinarily powerful thing to bring together, because as you say, when you're in these spaces, there is that landscape that sometimes is more hidden and sometimes less hidden, but to bring it to the attention of those that are there, that this is the very space that these events were happening in, could I think really enhance any visitor's experience. Thank you so much today for your presentation. It's been a real pleasure hearing you, working with you. I do hope that someday in the perhaps COVID-free future, we're able to get you to Kansas City. That would be a real delight. So thank you for that. And thank you all for joining us here this afternoon. Just to remind you of a couple of upcoming programs. On January 27th, we have Robert Jan van Pelt, who will be talking to us about Auschwitz. He's also one of the curators on Auschwitz not long ago, not far away. And that will be January 27th, 6:30 on Zoom as well. And then February 8th, we will have David Marwell, a reschedule from the fall. He will be talking about his book, Mengele, Unmasking the Angel of Death. So that's February 8th at 6:30 p.m. as well on Zoom. Thank you all and have a good rest of your afternoon.